Away Maganiduk, Ndisi Indigenous, Makinak Waju Indunjiba, Migizi Indudame. I say greetings, my relatives. My name is Blue Jay in Ojibwe, and I am from Turtle Mountain, and I am Eagle Clan. Hey, Anishinabe's in the house. I'm the executive officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. My English name is Christine McCleave, and we also have Rose Miron. She is our program manager. She's non-native, but she can't prove it. Thank you for coming today, and we're going to kind of go quickly through a few of these introductory slides and get to the heart of what we want to talk to today, which is our call to action for tribes to start collecting boarding school information and records and helping us locate the records. So the Boarding School Healing Coalition was formed by the Native American Rights Fund in 2012 as the result of a national symposium that brought together leaders from this country and Canada. And in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had already started. And the symposium, basically everybody agreed that we needed a process like that here in the US. So the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition was born. We say NABS for short. We are a 501c3 nonprofit now. We're financially independent from NARF, even though they helped birth the organization. We have a board of directors that's 100% Native American, and then we have a coalition of over 120 members who are both individuals as well as tribal organizations, tribes, and non-Native organizations. Our vision is Indigenous cultural sovereignty, and our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. We usually give an educational talk that makes sure to set that historical context for people, but basically a quick overview is that there are over 350 boarding schools in the U.S. This publication that we're giving you all a copy of, the centerfold, has a list that was compiled by one of our board members, Dr. Denise Lashmadir. It's the only list that we know of that has been compiled in the U.S. of all the boarding schools. It took her years to vet these, and we know that a lot of people have heard the number 500, but what we think is that that includes 150 day schools, and so our list is just boarding schools. It also shows on this list that 64 of those boarding schools remain open today. So what we focus on is the historical boarding school era. We know that some of the boarding schools that are still open today are often being run by tribes or in cooperation with tribes. They promote language and culture instead of prohibiting language and culture. And in the historical boarding school era, the first generation was forcibly removed. They were abducted in some cases. Rations could be withheld. Parents could be incarcerated for not letting their children go to boarding school. And not everyone experienced abuse, but we know that a great deal of people who attended did experience abuse. Even something as simple as when you got there, you had to be stripped naked and you had to walk through with all these other students and people looking at your naked body, and then you would be deloused, and what they were often sprayed with was DDT. And so things like that. And then just being raised by an institution and not having the nurturing care of a family or a tribal community around you. And the effects are intergenerational in our families, and but that's not what we're here to talk about. We do know that the purpose of the boarding schools was cultural genocide. It was forced assimilation. At the commencement of the class that graduated in 1898 at Carlisle, the first off-reservation federal-run boarding school in the U.S., the commencement speaker, Reverend Lippincott, told the class, "Let all that is Indian within you die." We have an article in this publication, and we work with our relatives over at the First Nations Repatriation Institute, and we're doing a study in conjunction with the University of Minnesota to show the connection between the boarding schools and current day adoption and foster care. As we know, and we've seen in the last few days, ICWA is under attack. And so it's really important right now to understand the historical context of why the Indian Child Welfare Act was put into place, that there was a child removal being systematically done based on race. So this problem is ingrained in our systems. It moved from the boarding schools to the Indian Adoption Project, and our children are still represented in higher rates per capita than any other ethnic minority in the foster care systems, as well as the prison system. So there's many ways that they've removed our people from our communities. So this one is same thing. It's talking about that cycle of, you know, pre-colonization, when our families were all together, our communities were strong and in harmony. And then the boarding school era happened, and they were put into military institutions or missionary institutions. And then in the 50s and 60s, the BIA started the Indian Adoption Project. A lot of boarding schools started to close down, and our children were then placed straight into non-native homes instead of into boarding schools. And now they're still being placed into foster care, which oftentimes leads to adoption. So by the 1930s, an estimated 2/3 of natives had attended boarding school at some point in their lifetime. By the 70s, approximately 25 to 35% of all native children were being placed in foster homes, adoptive homes, or institution. 85% of these children were placed outside their families and communities, even when fit and willing relatives were available to care for them. So our study is going to look at the impacts of boarding school, the intergenerational impacts, and really what we're hoping to prove through the study is something that we know anecdotally through people's sharing of their stories and experiences, is that oftentimes when there was a family member who went to boarding school, then subsequent generations ended up being adopted or being taken into foster care, because when we found that when you're raised by that boarding school institution, that then when you have children, when we have children, I've experienced this personally in my family, that we don't have the parenting skills. We don't have those traditional ways and that traditional knowledge of how to raise our children and how to pass on our culture. So we're looking at a study that will show those impacts and that correlation between boarding school and adoption. This is an example of some of the records that we're trying to locate, and it just shows that the importance of truth in history that can be told by finding these records. So this was a missionary letter from 1952 where they sent $10, and the Indian school said, "We'll send you a child, whatever you want, boy or girl. There's no one who cares whether they live or die or come and go. If you really mean it, LC, we get them ready and you can have them anytime you want. I'm not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did." So today we understand this as human trafficking. And we know that a lot of people experience sexual abuse in boarding schools and in these placements into homes. And so this could be considered sex trafficking as well. So we're looking to hold the U.S. government and the churches accountable for the boarding school era, and things like this. Historical documents like this will help tell that story. So we know that these were federally funded, and in some cases church-run boarding schools. About half of them were church-run. These are the different denominations that ran schools. We also know that recent studies on epigenetics about the DNA markers that get passed down when you experience trauma. But what we like to emphasize is the hope and the resiliency in our communities. If we carry the intergenerational trauma, which we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and it's in our DNA. So I'm gonna let Rose talk about what we're doing at NABS around education, and specifically as it relates to this conference and finding the records for boarding schools.
Okay, so as Christine talked about, there's some that we do know about the U.S. Indian boarding schools, and we can learn a lot from records like what she showed us in terms of human trafficking and how children were moved across the country. But there's a lot that we don't know. And what we've been hearing from communities as we've spoken with people is that we have to understand the truth of what happened really as a foundation for healing to begin. And so that's a really integral part of our mission and a really big part of what we're working on now. So we've started this process through our online database, which has currently about 300 different resources, which it mostly includes modern day discussions about boarding schools, so news articles, articles that can be found online, academic articles, but also just information about where some of these records are that we do know. This map is one of our biggest research projects that we've done to date. As Christine said, Dr. Denise Lajmadier, who is a former board member of ours, compiled this, and we're actually still updating it. So, right now I think we're up to about 357 schools, and we're constantly finding more because nobody has really done this research, and part of what we're really trying to do with this is to really get a full accounting for how many schools there were, and how massively spread out this was across the country. These are some of the things that we are doing research on today. So as I discussed, we're looking at the history of U.S. Indian boarding schools. We are collecting personal stories from boarding school survivors to learn about their experiences, but also to focus on healing and learn about what they're doing in their healing journeys. As Christine mentioned, one of the studies we're working on, we're really looking at those impacts of intergenerational trauma. We have to understand through research and through data how this history has affected Native communities in order to really turn to the government and turn to some of these people in churches and really try to hold them accountable. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about particularly today is the records of U.S. Indian boarding schools. So you can see that 351 boarding schools number on the top there. That's, again, a little bit of an old number since we found a couple more since we made this map. But you can see right now the records that we're most familiar with are the records in the National Archives, which have a number of different branches across the country. So there are 9 National Archives, and they hold 61 of 61 schools' records. That leaves 283 schools, and actually 290 now with those additional schools that we've found since then, records that we don't know where the records of those schools are. So that means 81% of the schools, we don't know where those records are, and we don't know what happened at those schools per se. So what we want to talk about today is really that mission and really working with tribes, working with other archives across the country to locate those records and then to make them accessible to particularly boarding school survivors and descendants. And so one of the ways that we want to do that is by expanding our online database. So as I mentioned, right now we have about 300 or so resources, and you can see this is a screenshot of our database on the bottom here. So it's searchable by school, it's searchable by theme. We've identified a couple of themes at the bottom there. And it's searchable by year, keyword, but we really want to expand that, and our goal is really to have the biggest archive of boarding school records, because right now if people are looking for their family histories, if they're looking to understand what happened to their relatives, those records could be scattered in 3 or 4 different archives, and they could be on different sides of the country. And we know that research, it costs money, it's time consuming, and it's impossible for most people. And so we want to make sure that we make those records accessible. But with digitization comes a really important considerations of what really should be made public and what should be placed online. And so one of the things that we also really want to emphasize today is the importance of data sovereignty. And data sovereignty is a movement that really seeks to reverse the paternalism that is present in a lot of archives and museums, whereby Native people have very little power or control over records of their histories. And so data sovereignty is really all about making sure that Native communities have the power and control to determine how their records are represented, if they're made available to the public at all, and in what context. And so as we develop this digital archive, we really want to make sure that that Native people have control over what we digitize and what we don't. So we want to be really careful that, before we put boarding school records related to a tribe online, we ensure that we ask their permission, we ask them, if it makes sense to have those records online or not. Is there a question? It's a tribe. We would contact the tribe, and we would work with, if the tribe has a historic preservation office or they have a library museum, that would probably be our first point of contact, otherwise tribal council. And then we would work with them to determine, first of all, to share the records and to say, to share what we found. And that's, our first priority is to make that accessible to the tribe. But then the next steps would be, okay, would you like this stuff digitized? Would it be helpful to tribal members to have it digitized and online? And if so, do you want part of it digitized? Do you want all of it digitized? Would you want to digitize part of it but redact certain information? And so those are all things that we're thinking about as we kind of start the process.
And that's why we're here. We want to have this dialogue. There's a few other things that I wanted to add to what Rose is saying, just in the larger context. So a lot of the research that needs to be done to shed light on the true story and the history of what happened starts with those records, right? And so, like in Canada, when they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the government and the churches brought all the records forward, and boarding school survivors came and they shared testimony. So right now you can go on the internet and you can read a 7-volume report, like literally 7 books like this, of what the residential schools in Canada looked like, how many schools there were, how many children went from what tribal nations, what happened to those children. I mean, everything is detailed. What were the impacts? Everything's detailed in that 7-volume report. Here in the US, we still don't even have the truth, right? So our first step in addressing and understanding the impacts of the boarding school is to find these records. And we want to uphold data sovereignty because of, like Rose said, that paternalism. And we just held our first national conference last week in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and we curated a panel called Academics, Colonization and Data Sovereignty, because what we're finding is that, people with a lot more resources than us, we're a staff of 2, and we're, this national nonprofit with a shoestring budget, but these universities and these people who have all these resources are going and they're digitizing these records. So there are already digital archives online. My great-grandfather went to Carlisle boarding school, and I saw a picture of him in someone else's PowerPoint presentation. Things like that, where we need to consider that this information that people are putting online is about somebody's relatives. So we are trying to make sure that we work with tribal nations and that we're sensitive to people's information. We don't want to make the same mistakes that have been made. But this is all new territory. First of all, this has never been done. So what we're doing here at ATALM is collecting information, making these connections so that we can have conversations about how to go about this. And the reason I hired Rose is because she just finished her dissertation at the University of Minnesota, and she worked with a tribal nation to build their tribal archive. And as a non-native ally, she upholds data sovereignty, and that's why I hired her. So I just wanted to also mention that. And so the other thing that's unique about what we're trying to do with not only the archives but collecting the information is we've already had different representatives from either a TIPO office or somebody on a tribal council saying, I want to know about what happened to all our children from such and such tribe. And the terrible thing is that there's no way to go research by the tribe. You have to research by the boarding school. And as we know, they sent children from all over the country to individual boarding schools, and that they were, the children were put together intertribally. So we have to work backwards to find the records for all the schools, and then we'll find out whose children were there, and then we'll contact the tribes. And so we have this mammoth project ahead of us, so we welcome your feedback and your questions, but just wanted to, put that into context of where we're at. We're really in the conceptual stages.
South Dakota and North Dakota are both on there. And there's a updated copy of this in the middle of the publication in the centerfold that you could take a closer look at.
And if you see anything that's missing on the list or the map, let us know. Because like she said, we're still updating it.
Yeah, it's in progress. We're definitely still gathering information. I should mention too, the criteria that we used to create the map was that students had to be at the school for 9 months or more. So we don't have day schools on here, or schools that students maybe went to just for like a couple months or so. You had to be there for more than 9 months of the year. And so that's what Christine was saying before, with sometimes we hear that number of about 500 schools. And you know, we don't deny that day schools were also very assimilative and had many of the same effects that boarding schools had, but that's kind of specific to our mission. So I think we kind of covered this slide. So I think the rest of the PowerPoint is just kind of talking about some of the other projects we have going on. We just wanted to give everybody a sense of that.
So the website for that database is boardingschoolhealing.org. Boardingschoolhealing.org. So it's free to access the database. We just ask that you create a login ID so that we can track it for funding purposes, how many people are using our educational resources. We also worked with NIEA to create a curriculum for teachers, counselors, and administrators. So it's not a student curriculum. It's a professional development curriculum. And what we want to do is create trauma-informed schools, get the information to both native teachers and mostly non-native teachers of our students in urban centers, so that they understand the history, not only boarding schools, but all the layers of trauma that have happened to our Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island, and so that they can understand how these children in their classrooms may be dealing with historical trauma, maybe dealing with intergenerational trauma, what a trauma response looks like, you know, when a student is deregulated. There was just an article that came out this week about how we really do expect our teachers nowadays to kind of triage these situations. They're the first line. They see when a child is having a bad day because they may be experiencing some kind of abuse or unsettled experience at home. So we want to help train teachers to recognize trauma responses and to know how to react, how to create the whole school environment that will care for the children instead of saying, you know, what's wrong with you? They would ask what happened to you, and not disciplining the children for something that's out of their control. So this is professional development curriculum that we're doing with NIA, and the next step after we help create some of those trauma-informed schools would be then to do a curriculum for students. But we're thinking mostly high school level because it's just such a difficult topic to cover with younger school-age children. But that's where we're going with curriculum. We're also looking to use some of the videos that we're collecting, interviews of boarding school survivors that are focused on healing and hope to create a curriculum that way as well. One of the things that we try to consider when doing the Healing Voices videos was we didn't want to create more videos that were highlighting our relatives' trauma. We didn't want them breaking down on camera and reliving their trauma and then therefore traumatizing the people who would watch it, you know, because we can experience that secondary or vicarious trauma. So we were really intentional about not creating those kinds of videos, and so, like I said, the videos are focused on healing. We are also working with tribal nations in the repatriation going on at Carlisle. I've heard from a lot of other tribal leaders who want repatriation done from other boarding schools, and right now it's just Carlisle. It's going to have to be a case-by-case basis with other boarding schools because Carlisle's a unique situation where it's still an Army barracks, and so the Army Corps of Engineers is actually paying for these children to be exhumed, transported, and reinterned. And you know, if we went to a different boarding school cemetery that was, you know, abandoned, we don't know who's going to be able to pay for that, if the tribal nation can pay for it or if individual family members have to pay for it. So repatriation is going on a case-by-case basis. Yes? So that's a really good question. She said, are we going to create a fund where we can assist people who want to repatriate or to take care of the cemeteries? And that would be a great idea, a great project that we would love to do. But right now, we are struggling for funds. So this publication doesn't have it, but if you go onto our website, you can look at our annual report. And our budget last year was $250,000. So we would love to do something like that, but we'd have to definitely partner with somebody who had the funds to do that. And so what we did do was, after the first tribe, the Northern Arapaho, repatriated some children last summer, they were bringing 3 children home, and they found 2, and the third grave for Little Plume was, they found 2 sets of remains, and neither one matched his age and gender. And so at that, we thought, this impacts all the other tribes who have children buried there, and we know that some of those tribes did not want their children disturbed, that they did not have a ceremony or a protocol for reburial. And so they were just going to leave their children at rest there in Carlisle. So we invited all the 59 tribes with children buried there. The number of unknown graves went from 12 to 14, and we just, held that forum to allow people to dialogue about where they were at in the process and what did they want to see done going forward. And so about half the tribes showed up, and about half of those are actively pursuing repatriation of their children. The other half are, or a quarter of the total are kind of, in places where they don't know. They're talking with their elders. They are discussing whether or not they want to create a new ceremony for this, and then a few of them are still just saying no. We're not gonna disturb them. So this past year, 4 more children were repatriated from a couple other tribal nations. And we know up in Alaska that they've had a really hard time because a lot of the children that were taken to Carlisle, at the time, Alaska wasn't even a state. A lot of those Alaska Native children were orphans. And so the Army's process is that you have to have a relative sign the affidavit in order to get them repatriated. Because they're not even using the word repatriation. They're not considering this a NAGPRA case. It's not going through NAGPRA. And we'll be at the Association of American Indian Affairs conference next month on repatriation to talk about how NAGPRA really doesn't address this particular issue. So there's all kinds of complicated things going on. We're doing our best, and we send prayers to all those relatives and to those children who want to return home. So this is a picture of some Alaskan orphans who were sent to Carlisle. So they were placed on a boat and they were sent so far away from what they knew. This was, our conference. We're gonna have some follow-up about that in the coming weeks, but Rose and I still haven't been back to the office since the conference. So we're here at this conference, then we're going to another conference. But another thing we're working on is this filing to the United Nations. We're working with the Native American Rights Fund, the International Indian Treaty Council, the Rosebud Tribe, and NICWA. And it's for children who went missing at boarding schools whose whereabouts are still unknown. And so it's a combination of testimony from relatives and what we've been able to find in the records. Preston McBride is doing his dissertation at UCLA. He's a member of the coalition. He's Comanche descent. And he looked at Chemawa, Carlisle, Sherman, and Haskell, just 4 boarding schools. And he found 12 children who went missing on the records and or died and their families weren't notified. And so out of just 4 schools, 12 children were found through the records as missing. So how many more children out of all those 357 boarding schools? So this is a photo that I had our graphic designer put together, this overlay, because last year I went to the United Nations to read a statement about the children who went missing at boarding schools. And I was put on the agenda, but they went out of order. And so I was like, oh man, I don't know when I'm gonna talk. And you have to have your speech written, and you only have 3 minutes, and then they shut your microphone off. And so I'm sitting there and I'm waiting and I've got it and I'm going, oh my gosh, we're running out of time. And we had 15 minutes left and then the session was gonna end. And they were still not going in the right order. And I just started praying. And I thought, you know what? I'm here. I'm ready and I'm willing to read, and if you want this to happen, you're gonna have to make it happen. And then I was the second to last person to read, so I really felt like they wanted to be heard. And so this picture represents that they were there at the United Nations. These are the children that we found who went missing. Alaskan, Pueblo, Seneca, Mission from La Jolla, Mission Pechanga, Standing Rock, Wintune, another one who's Alaskan, and Mission from San Diego. And that's another thing too, is in these records, they just say Alaskan, or they'll just say Sioux, and they don't, there has to be a little bit more digging into the records to see where the children really came from and who their tribal nation is. So take a look. We'll be putting up our Healing Voices videos very shortly. We just launched them at the conference. The hashtag is Break the Silence, Begin the Healing. We encourage people to share their stories within their families, not necessarily for anyone's particular project, not for us to gain some kind of recognition, but just for that healing to take place within your own families. This is Patsy Whitefoot. She was our first board member who interviewed for Healing Voices, and she said, we need to continue to hold up our children, our babies, because that's who we are in the future beyond our life here. So follow us on social media and email us if you have any questions. Thank you.